We've had actually a rough start of the year with the M&A markets being quite slow. However, I think we're starting to see some light at the end of the tunnel with the market stabilizing, and I think there's a lot more activity starting to happen. Now is the time for action to do thoughtful planning, preparation, and get ready to actually go after the opportunities the M&A market presents as the market actually reactivates in the second half of the year.
So what is different now then than the sort of optimism that we had at the end of last year? Because forgive me, Danny, the world doesn't seem any more certain. Are we just more used to uncertainty?
I think yes. As I've had discussions with my clients and investment bankers, private equity, I think there's also a realization that we live in a new reality, that there is a level of uncertainty that is not totally going to go away. So the question more is, will people just remain on the sidelines on a wait and see mode, or will there be an adjustment to expectations about living with a level of uncertainty and the level of risk? And the question is more, there's always risk in life and in business. How do you manage that risk, and what risk is okay to take and not, and how do you assess it, and how do you prepare for it? And I think what we're starting to see now in the last weeks and month is some players getting back into the market, probably with this new assessment of reality. There are some parts of the economy that are more insulated from this trade uncertainty within each region, within each market. One example of that is the very large Union Pacific Norfolk deal that just got announced, train transportation cross-continental within the U.S. Well, it might be affected by, of course, the economy and the state of things. It's not a direct trade impact. And so I think there's pockets where there's less risk, and there's also the players adjusting expectations and managing risk. And I think that's beginning to change. So there's a bit more stability, a little less uncertainty, although we're not totally there. And there's also a change of expectations. And those two things are actually enabling probably more deals to actually happen now.
In terms of the recovery, how fast are you expecting it to be? You're expecting perhaps one or two big deals and that'll set the ball rolling, or is it going to be a bit more slow and steady?
Yep. I can't be sure about that. However, I'll say this. There's record levels of dry powder available in the market. So there's a lot of pent-up demand from that. Second, there's structural reasons why M&A should be and could be happening a lot more, like digitization, AI. I think that's causing a lot of deal activity. We saw some of that in semiconductors, different companies building capabilities and building into that. At the same time, also, I think there's a lot of pent-up demand on the private equity side, where for private equity players to actually be able to continue raising capital, they actually have to materialize assets that they have in their portfolio and bring them to market and return capital to their investors, to limited partnerships, and then be able to raise more capital. So I think on the private equity side also, there's a lot of pent-up demand. We're starting to see some of that activity restarting. As I talk to some of my private equity partners, they're actually starting to see a lot more activity and also deadlines of some of those due diligences coming up. So we could see at the end of this summer, beginning of the fall, a lot more activity also on the private equity side. And so I think all this points to the direction of a reactivation of the market. And so to your question about how fast, I would expect actually faster than not because of all this pent-up demand. And there's also a little bit of a psychology of the market. Once it starts seeing, players start seeing people getting into it, we could see actually a relatively fast reactivation in the coming months.
More specifically, just digging into some of that activity. I mean, we spoke about the picture is across regions and sectors, but are there any areas that are particularly active right now?
So first, from a geographic perspective, Europe and North America actually have remained low but relatively stable. Asia Pacific was hit pretty badly in terms of deal volume. I think the economies in Asia Pacific, many of them are actually quite exposed to trade. And so it's not surprising that there was even more slowdown and wait and see in Asia Pacific. I think Asia Pacific is still lower than Europe and North America. However, we're starting to see a uptick of activity and expectations in all three regions. The sharpest uptick is actually in Asia Pacific. We have this metric that we've developed based on AI called the BCG M&A sentiment. We've had it running already for over a year. And so while it's remained a little bit below average, and in Asia Pacific in particular, quite low, in the last weeks, we've seen a very sharp uptick in expectations in all three regions. And the fastest is Asia Pacific, partly because it's starting from a very low position, but also partly because what I was saying before. I think there's in the market is starting to see a reactivation, and so there's a lot of pent up demand, and so we see a lot more activity and expectations about more activity coming up.
And sectors?
On the sector side, I was looking at the data just in the last days. Consumer and industrial goods were particularly hard hit at the beginning of the year. We saw a lot more drop in activity, probably because of the exposure to trade. And will all this lead to consumer demand going down and potentially even a recession? And I think we're seeing now a reactivation in those areas, but also across all the industries. Technology has always been relatively active. We're seeing an uptick there. Healthcare, same thing. I think all sectors, we're starting to see an increasing activity. Again, historically, this remained relatively on the average side, but I think in all places we're seeing an uptick.